Welcome to the American Indian Homeschool. I am Ms.Nebraska on all social media platforms, and I am from the Muskogee Creek tribe. Together, we are going to interpret the 14th Amendment starting at the beginning. This is interpreting our birthright citizenship to America. In 2025, the sitting president issued an executive order protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. This declared that illegal immigrants would no longer be afforded the rights to the United States Constitution. In this document, an illegal immigrant is defined as a child whose mother is not under the jurisdiction of the United States. The president goes on in a press conference to say that the 14th Amendment is for the children of those enslaved throughout American history. The community is often referred to as the Black population, prompting a very important question. How did our mothers become subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? The United States is built on precedent law. Precedent law means standing by that which has already been decided. And it also means upholding the meaning and value of laws must be traced throughout history. To understand how the mothers of the Black population became under the jurisdiction of, we must start at the beginning. The baby follows the belly law. The baby follows the belly law is a Latin term, and it translates to that which is brought forth follows the womb. This law has commonly been referred to as the baby follows the belly law. This is the law that made us all born into slavery until we were freed with the 13th Amendment. So in public schools, we are taught that we were born into slavery until the great United States gifted us with the freedom of the 14th Amendment. But they never informed us about how we were born into slavery. When you dig deeper to find out how we were born into slavery and what laws allow someone to be born into slavery, you find the baby follows the belly law of 1662 and 1682, 125 years and 100 years before the United States was ever formed, placing all Black people in colonial America again before the United States was ever formed. So it's important to understand that precedence trumps any other form of law. So understanding how laws are built throughout the precedents of history is how you interpret a law. When the United States Supreme Court is interpreting birthright citizenship, they are starting at the Dred Scott decision of 1865. That is not how you interpret a law. So we're going to start at the beginning. I want you guys to understand that interpreting laws for the American Indian homeschool is going to be very different than how laws were taught to us in public schools. So for example, let's look at the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction of, except as punishment for crime. So in public school, they teach you that law with those words abolish slavery. Here in the American Indian homeschool, I will teach you that the 13th Amendment cannot abolish something and make it legal at the same time. So our foundation of understanding and precedent law is based on logic, facts, and precedents. You cannot abolish something and make it legal at the same time. So our American Indian interpretation of the 13th Amendment is that the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. It created a loophole that allowed slavery to be legalized as a punishment for crime. This would be the foundation of mass incarceration and over-policing that we are still dealing with till this day. So it is important as we find our foundation of how we are going to interpret laws as the American Indian homeschool that we all understand that our interpretations are going to be different because our interpretations are based on precedent law, telling the truth, and having integrity. So our interpretations are not colonized. They are decolonized interpretation of the laws that enslaved us and reclassified us. It is important that I address the biggest elephant in the room, which is why am I identifying us as American Indians and not as Black? My background is in legal research and writing, and it's important for us all to understand that we do not legally fit into the definition of Black on the United States Census. The federal government defines Black as a person having origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa, whose mother or ancestors has a tribe they are from and can point to. This is a category used correctly by African immigrants. African immigrants and Black Americans should not be identifying in the same category because we are not from the same place. So Black Americans, we have birthright citizenship to America through the 14th Amendment. And you cannot be born in America and born in Africa. You can only be born one place. So we are born in America. It's important that we look at how American Indian is defined on the United States Census. American Indian is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of America. Now, let's go back to the hidden law, the baby follows the belly. It's important that we understand as a community that terms like erasure do absolutely apply to us. If we don't understand this, then it is impossible for us to trace our own identity. When we understand that history has been told to us in a colonized way, we can then open our hearts and our minds to look at the laws and interpret them correctly. So let's look at how the baby follows the belly law that made us all born into slavery, that was erased from history, places all of our mothers as the original people of America. In 1662, which I think we can all agree is before 1787, when the United States was formed. So this is America, not the United States. This is the very first baby follows the belly law, and it was created to address the concern of the offspring of enslaved African women with free English European men. The colonial America, the 13 colonies, would decide that the condition of the mother is how slavery would be determined. This law of 1662 would label these children mulatto. In 1682, with a law called an act to repeal a former law making Indians and others free, American Indian women would also come under the subjection of the baby follows the belly law, which means all of their offspring would be enslaved. So that is their mixed children with European men, that is their mixed children with American Indian men, that is their mixed children with anyone, and just all American Indian children. This makes up the vast majority of the population of enslaved people in the United States. Unfortunately, this law has been completely erased out of history. So there's no way for us to understand that we are the offspring, the children, the babies of the baby follows the belly law, which makes us American Indians, because our mothers are the original people of America. So it is also important to understand that you can be the original people of America and have African descent. So while not all of us have African descent, it is important to understand that you can be the original people of America and have African descent. Just like the 14th Amendment solidifies all of our American citizenship to this American soil, whether we are the 5% of Africans that are bought on the slave trade, or whether we are the 90% of American Indians who were trafficked through the domestic slave trade that has been erased out of history. Because the baby follows the belly law is from 1662 and 1682, that makes our lineage the original people of America. These laws made everyone born into slavery, and it places our mothers in the original America 100 and 125 years before the United States was ever formed. So by law, we are the original people, the American soil-born descendants of the baby follows the belly law, 1662, 1682, and then we would be freed with the 13th Amendment. So in conclusion, because we are already at the conclusion, because that is all you need to prove that we are the original people of America, is the baby follows the belly law and the 13th Amendment. That creates the timeline that shows you that we are older than the United States. It is important that we understand that you can only free who you enslaved. So you can only free the mulatto children of African and European men, and you can only free the American Indians, who make up the majority of those enslaved, who are the American soil-born children of the baby follows the belly law. The reality is what governs our 14th Amendment is our right to the soil being born in America through the baby follows the belly law. So the most important question remains, which is, how did our identity change from the original people to Black citizens? Let's look at this timeline. In 1662 and in 1682, it is now revealed to us, and now we know the truth, that our enslavement was based off of the condition of our mothers. So we all know that 1662 and 1682 is before the United States was formed in 1787. So again, that makes us the original people of America, because if there's no United States, it's America. So Great Britain established the baby follows the belly law in colonial America, the first 13 colonies, enslaving indigenous children from the womb for the sake of slave labor. So as if there wasn't anything worse than chattel slavery, the Baby Follows the Belly law reveals that the United States participated in enslaving indigenous children for the sake of slave labor. It's important to understand that in 1776, this is the group of people who won their freedom against Great Britain and declared their American independence. I want to make it exceptionally clear to everyone that the United States did not exist in 1776, so they have nothing to celebrate on July 4th, 1776. The United States was formed because, again, we base our interpretations of the law off of precedence law, and the United States Constitution was formed in 1787. And we know this because the United States Constitution called for an enumeration, which is a census, to be taken within 3 years. That takes us to the 1790 United States Census. So while colonial America participated in the Baby Follows the Belly law and enslaving American Indians, once those American Indians were free, whether they had African descent or not, because they are the original people, once they declared their freedom from Great Britain, the United States took illegal jurisdiction of them with the United States Constitution and the 3/5 Compromise. So that's in 1787. So that shows us that the Constitution is an erasure tool that was used to conflate our identities because of the color of our skin. Historically, there has always been two groups of people enslaved. That is those who came from the African slave trade. And based on the recent slave trade database that is held at Harvard, there's only 5% of enslaved Africans that make up the population of those enslaved, which means that American Indian women took on the brunt of creating the slave population to the high number representing 95% of those enslaved. So the United States Census, because they knew that they were enslaving these people now for 100 years, with Section 2 said that they would count all enslaved people as 3 for every 5, so that the enslaved population could not overpower the political party of the American soil-born European colonizers. So in 1787, that would be the first time that we were reclassified through Section 2 of the United States Constitution, which is the 3/5 Compromise. The Baby Follows the Belly law would not be overturned until 1865 with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment removed the law that you could be born into slavery, which is the Baby Follows the Belly law, which solidifies our identity because no one came in and no one got out. So they genetically breeded a generation of people who can only be the original people of America because of the Baby Follows the Belly. And this is why the Baby Follows the Belly law has been completely erased out of history, because it proves that we are Americans before the United States was ever formed. So the Baby Follows the Belly law to the 13th Amendment shows how so-called Black Americans, how their history starts in the original America, and then how we were taken jurisdiction of by the United States over time. So this is a timeline. I want to make it extremely clear that your identity cannot change. If your greatest ancestors are the original people of America, there's no way for your identity to change unless it is changed on paper. So in 1662 and in 1682, because the Baby Follows the Belly law places us in America and we are the American soil-born children, our identity doesn't change over time. The United States changes how they reclassify us over time. So in 1776, all men were created equal. In 1787, with the 3/5 Compromise, white men would be counted as whole and everyone else would be counted as 3 for every 5. It is important to understand that in 1865, the 13th Amendment overturned the Baby Follows the Belly law, which means no more born into slavery. So then we have to ask the very important question, which is, so why do we need the 14th Amendment? It's important to understand that the connection between the Baby Follows the Belly law and the 13th Amendment, because then you can understand the scramble by the United States to make sure that they can somehow take jurisdiction of these American people that they have no lawful jurisdiction of. And that is how we have the 14th Amendment, or why we have the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment in 1868, 3 years after the 13th Amendment, is extremely important in our reclassification. So the United States, when they go to interpret the 14th Amendment, they're going to start at the Dred Scott decision. That's smoke and mirrors. The Dred Scott decision is about political power and changing those enslaved from 3/5 to 5/5 and counting them as whole. And the United States trying to figure out how are they going to take jurisdiction of these people? How are they going to govern these people? And how are they going to keep political power? So unfortunately, we were not told about the 13th Amendment. So we had no idea that we were free. 14th Amendment rolling around just 3 years later is kind of insane. It only makes sense when you realize that it's not a gift to us, but it is an erasure of who we really are. Once we were granted the 14th Amendment, our American Indian reality through the Baby Follows the Belly law was erased. So we were granted birthright citizenship to the United States, erasing our American Indian identity through the Baby Follows the Belly law. And this was done on purpose. So let's start with how we were reclassified over time. That reclassification actually starts with the Baby Follows the Belly law. So once you erase the Baby Follows the Belly law of 1682 that enslaved American Indian mothers, we were taught in school that we were all born into slavery, but that we were the children of the original Baby Follows the Belly law of 1662. So by conflating these two laws, the United States is able to erase the identity of the American Indians enslaved, who make up the great majority of the enslaved population. So the Baby Follows the Belly law is actually the beginning of the reclassification, because when you eliminate one part of that law, then it only provides one history for us to believe that is our own. By conflating the history of the Baby Follows the Belly law of 1662 with the Baby Follows the Belly law of 1682, the narrative of Black chattel slavery history often erases the fact that many indigenous people didn't just die or become extinct. They were reclassified legally out of existence, and that is called a paper genocide. The systematic erasure obviously doesn't stop there. And I want to continue to remind you that this is still America, colonial America. We haven't even gotten to the United States form of reclassification quite yet. The Virginia Slave Act of 1705 continued the reclassification of American Indians by conflating our history with the African slave trade. So what it did was explicitly group together Negroes, mulattoes, and Indian slaves as real estate rather than people, allowing them to be inherited, sold, and traded like monopoly. This was another part of the paper genocide. So when they used these laws to determine how all of us would be treated, which is American Indians, Negroes, mulattoes, and slave Indians, this would be the foundation of them saying that we're all the same people. So after the 1705 Virginia Act, let's look at the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740, which is one of my favorite legal documents because for the very first time, it explains what the term Negro means and who is all encompassed in that. Not only does it explain that to us, it also explains who is all enslaved throughout colonial America. Section 1 of the South Carolina Negro Law states that all American Indians, Negroes, mulattoes, and Mezitoes are to be chattel slaves, and their children are to follow the condition of the mother. So again, this is called the South Carolina Negro Law. So again, what I'm showing you is how they were using these laws to slowly over time say that all the people enslaved are the same people. But throughout colonial America, we were not all the same people. We have never all been the same people. So again, in 1740 and 1705, and in the Baby Follows the Belly law, there was always multiple groups of people of color enslaved, which is American Indians, Negroes, mulattoes, and Mezitoes. Mezitoes is defined as an American Indian mixed with anyone from the African slave trade. So that is a new identity that has also been erased out of history, which could give a lot of us insight on who we really are. Mezitoes, again, is American Indians mixed with those enslaved. So another important part about the South Carolina Negro Law is it finally gives a name to who we are. And the name is called slave Indians. And these slave Indians are defined and categorized as completely different than Indians in amity with the government. Indians in amity with the government would go on to call themselves Native Americans. So the South Carolina Negro Law, again, of 1740, for the first time identifies who we really were. A history of slave Indians enslaved through the Baby Follows the Belly law and freed with the 13th Amendment who have been completely erased out of history. So again, the Negro Law of 1740 is giving us a lot of information about who is really enslaved for the very first time, because I think we all know that throughout the public school information in the United States, we're always told one story, which is the African slave trade. And now through colonial laws, we see these new identities being revived, which is mulattoes, Mezitoes. And again, in modern education, they tell us, oh, you can't say these certain types of words. And they tell us because they're offensive. But it's actually, that's another part of erasure. We should know these identities so that we can trace ourselves and our origins and understand where we come from. Section 9 of the South Carolina Negro Law states that the term Negro is confined to the ancient BerBer people and their descendants. It goes on to say that this does not encompass the Moors or the free inhabitants of the Afroasiatic part of the world or North Africa. Why is this important? For so many reasons. Because this law of 1740, which is precedent law, trumps the public school myth of the West African slave trade. In law, in the American Indian homeschool, you cannot just make up stuff. You cannot just make up stories. There has to be a law, and when you understand the African slave trade, that was a business, and everything is recorded in maritime law. You cannot just say you got everybody from West Africa with no way to prove that, unless, of course, you're the United States. Here in the American Indian homeschool, we use precedent law, integrity, and telling the truth. The truth is that we are the ancient BerBer people. The ancient BerBer people are the indigenous inhabitants of North Africa. So now we have looked at how the baby follows the belly law, the Virginia Act of 1705, and the South Carolina Negro Law of 1740 have all set the precedents of law that there are multiple groups of people enslaved. These laws prove that American Indians have always been enslaved, called slave Indians. These laws also prove that slave Indians and Negroes from the African slave trade, the ancient BerBer people, are not the only people to be enslaved. That mulatto children were also enslaved, and now we have a new category of Mezito children, which is ancient BerBer mixed with American Indian. It is very important to know when we are talking about erasure that there is no legal mention in colonial law of the intermixing of American Indian women with European men. This large group of people would often be reclassified as mulattoes of the 1662 baby follows the belly law, who were African women with European fathers. I want to make that exceptionally clear that the term mulatto was originally for African mothers, but eventually it would be used to reclassify the children of American Indian mothers to claim that they are from Africa and that they have no interest in the soil, leaving their land to be stolen. Okay, so now after 1740, we can look at the United States Constitution as the next tool for erasure. And I've said this previously, that the 3/5 compromise was the erasure tool of the Constitution by saying that it is the law of the land that white men would be counted as whole and that everyone else enslaved. So let's talk about that. So the United States Constitution says that all other persons would be counted as 3 for every 5. So there's a few things that we need to talk about, which is who is all other persons? You know who all other persons are because we just identified them throughout precedent law of the baby follows the belly, the 1705 Virginia Act, and the 1740 South Carolina Negro Act. So all other persons is American Indians, Negroes, mulattoes, Mezitoes, and of course the American Indians who intermix with Europeans. So that is who would be counted as 3 for every 5. Now let's talk about that. In public school, we are taught as Black children that we were counted as 3/5 of a human on the Constitution. That is an intentional misinterpretation of a law that breeds inferiority into children. That is not what the 3/5 compromise says. The 3/5 compromise says that all other persons enslaved, which again is Indians, Negroes, mulattoes, and Mezitoes, would be counted as 3 for every 5. You could also say that as for every 500 of enslaved people of color, they would only count 300 so that the political pool would not be greater than the political pool of the descendants of Europeans who were now colonizing America. So the 3/5 rule has nothing to do with little black kids not being human. Again, that is an intentional form of inferiority and a grave misinterpretation of that actual law. So the 3/5 compromise is about multiple groups of people because historically and throughout precedent law, multiple groups of people have been enslaved. The United States Constitution takes us to the census of 1790. The census would be the greatest tool of reclassification. Now that the United States was recognized by Morocco, they would begin to put the American soil-born children of the baby follows the belly law on their census as black subjects to their newly formed government, completely erasing our identity as children of the baby follows the belly law of the original America. How and why would they do this? It's very important to understand that once America declared its independence, the United States then, with its recognition from Morocco, created its own constitution, and that these two are not the same legal document. So when we look at the United States Constitution as an erasure tool, we can understand that the 3/5 compromise was used to conflate the identities of many groups of people enslaved who were mulatto, Mezito, ancient BerBer, and American Indian into one group. Over time, we would be taught that this was just one group of enslaved people. From 1808, when the African slave trade was outlawed, until 1865, the enslaved population would rise by 3 million. With the slave trade over, the only way to account for this increase is through the baby follows the belly law of 1682 that enslaved American women and all her children. According to the slave trade database now held at Harvard, only 200,000 people arrived through the African slave trade to the United States territory. According to the slave trade database currently held at Harvard, only 200,000 people arrived safely to the United States territory from the African slave trade. So the reality of this 5% of enslaved Africans overpopulating our reality of the American Indians enslaved through the baby follows the belly law of 1682 would be completely diminished over time. Through the baby follows the belly law, intermixing, and forced breeding, the slave population on the United States census in 1810, 2 years after the importation of slaves was outlawed, was 1,191,000 individuals. According to the slave trade database at Harvard, only 200,000 people arrived on the African slave trade. In 1820, that number increased by 346,000 human bodies, 12 years after the African slave trade was outlawed. In 1830, that population increased by 471,000 human bodies, 222 years after the African slave trade was outlawed. In 1840, through the baby follows the belly law, that number of the enslaved population increased by 478,000 human bodies, enslaved 32 years after the African slave trade was outlawed. In 1850, through the baby follows the belly law, that number of enslaved individuals increased by 700,000 human bodies. This is 42 years after the African slave trade was outlawed. These census numbers show you that the reality of the African slave trade does not override our identity as the American Indians enslaved through the baby follows the belly law from 1682 until we were freed in 1865. The timeline of the African slave trade is from 1662 until 1808, which means that in each and every one of our lineages, there has to be an American Indian woman who had to take on the brunt of producing the slave population for the United States once the African slave trade was outlawed. With the numbers of enslaved people rising to 4 million, the United States was facing a grim reality, which is that they were going to have to free these American soil-born children. This would create a whirlwind for the United States government as they tried to figure out how they were going to take subjection of these American Indian people that they knew they lawfully could not. The way that the United States did this was through shifting the power from the states to the federal government. This started with the Dred Scott decision of 1857, and then the Civil War, and then the 13th Amendment that overturned the baby follows the belly law, and then the 14th Amendment that made us black subjects to the United States. Let's look at the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 states that Dred Scott is an enslaved African from Virginia. It is important to understand that Dred Scott is an American soil-born child of the baby follows the belly, just like all of us, which makes him an American Indian. Till this day, his parents are not known. You cannot determine someone's genealogy without knowing their parents. And the reason why we do not know his parents is because of the practice of the baby follows the belly law, where very young children would be taken from their parents and given to different plantations. And so the reality of him not knowing his mom was the reality of a lot of people at this time. Again, without knowing someone's parents, you cannot determine their DNA. Unfortunately, also, DNA wouldn't be invented for 145 years. This means that the United States Supreme Court made a decision about Dred Scott being from Africa when they had no legal proof to determine this. The legal proof did not exist, and it would not exist for 145 years. So while the Union North and the Supreme Court played with freedom, they were also openly codifying our reclassification in the Supreme Court of the law with the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision, in reality, was used to create a race of people that could not scientifically be proven so that they could lawfully discriminate against these same groups of people. It's important that we look at the Dred Scott decision that was read by Chief Taney. Chief Taney says, if we give rights to those with African descent, it would give persons of the Negro race who weren't recognized as citizens in any state the right to enter a state whenever they please, in companies without a pass or a passport and without obstruction, to sojourn there as long as they please. So they could commit some violation of law, which a white man would be punished, and it would give them the full liberty of speech in public and in private upon all subjects upon which its own citizens might speak. This was outrageous to him. He thought that that was insane. That black people would be able to speak and move freely. He said, we cannot have that. Chief Taney goes on to say, and all of this would be done in the face of the subject race of the same color, both free and slaves, inevitably producing discontent and insubordination among them. So what is Chief Taney saying? He's saying that they have two people enslaved of the same color, and that if we give rights to the Negro race, we would be doing that in the face of the slave race, the subject race of the same color. So who is he talking about? Because in the American Indian homeschool, we have traced the baby follows the belly law throughout precedent law, we know that the only group of people that he is talking about, which he also mentions in this decision, are the American Indians enslaved through the baby follows the belly law called slave Indians. So this creates a precedence from 1662 to 1857 that there has always been two groups of people enslaved of the same color. Chief Taney would make the decision that Dred Scott and his descendants should never have rights to the Constitution. Again, I want to reiterate that Dred Scott, his African descent was not determined lawfully. It was created through junk science by the Supreme Court, because there is no way to determine if Dred Scott was from Haiti, if he was from the South, if he was from somewhere else in the Caribbean islands or in South America. There's no way to determine where he came from, unless, of course, you're using the color of his skin in racism. So again, when we look at what Chief Taney is saying, the Dred Scott decision, although it is important, is not the most important part of that decision. What's important is that he is solidifying the true precedent law that two groups of people have historically always been enslaved, and they are the same color. After the Dred Scott decision, the United States would claim to openly detest this decision. While the United States claimed to openly detest this decision, they also used it as the foundation for the 14th Amendment, because they understood that the 13th Amendment overturning the baby follows the belly law means that you just freed American Indians who you have no right to subject to your jurisdiction. So the United States decided that they just wouldn't tell us that we were free. So at the same time as the 13th Amendment, black codes would be created to police and govern the newly freed individuals of the same color. So the same black codes would be used to police and govern the two groups of people mentioned by Chief Taney who were of the same color, which is Indians and the ancient Berber people defined as Negro on the South Carolina Negro Law of 1740. The United States' main goal was to keep control and to keep the same people that they just claimed to free under their subjection. The only way to do this was to grant those people birthright citizenship, but not to America, to the United States, which would completely erase the baby follows the belly law out of history, out of our minds, and out of our reality, making us black citizens to the United States, where in public school, we would be told, this is again why it's important for us as people to understand that certain terms do apply to us, like erasure and assimilation schools. So why we did not go to the assimilation schools of Native Americans, we went to assimilation schools of white supremacy, where we were told and taught that our history begins with our enslavement, which is absolutely not true. And if it does, the enslavement that it begins with places us as the original people of America, not subjects to a government that came hundreds of years after us. Once the United States overturned the baby follows the belly law with the 13th Amendment, the states, particularly the South, created black codes to over-police and govern that same group of people. In 1866, the United States would sign a treaty called the Creek Treaty of 1866, where the United States would claim that the Creek Indians had many descendants of African lineage. Just like the Dred Scott decision in 1866, there is no way to prove this. There's no way to prove someone's descent. And the reality that Africans would be granted tribal citizenship in land is simply not true. To enslave Africans, which the United States, in trying to erase the identity of American Indians, they will explain away things that we know don't make any sense. So we say, well, why was there people of color in the tribes? And the United States tells us, oh, well, Native Americans had African slaves. That is simply lawfully not true. To have African slaves, you had to have what was called an arcentio from a European government. No European government granted any Native American tribe an arcentio, a legal contract to enslave Africans. We are indeed the original people of those tribes. In 1866, the United States, along with those tribes, would use racist enumerators to come into the tribes and remove us from the tribes because we could not pick our own race until 1960. So the 14th Amendment not only reclassified people like Dred Scott, who are not a part of tribes, it also reclassified people of color who were a part of tribes. So now there's slave Indians and Indians in amity with the government who are tribal Indians that are being enslaved and put on the United States census as black. The next part of this story is my family's own personal oral history. My grandfather was born 1 month old on the Creek Freedman Roll on Indian Territory, Oklahoma, after walking the Trail of Tears. We ended up in Oklahoma. In 1921, Oklahoma experienced a terror attack by white colonizers. This is often referred to as Black Wall Street, but it's important to understand that Black Wall Street is located in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, which again goes towards showing you how history is erased by conflating our identity with the word black. So Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the riots of Tulsa, Oklahoma happened in Indian Territory, Oklahoma. However, that story has been reclassified as Black Wall Street, which erases our identity. So as my family was pushed off of Indian Territory between 1860 and 1960, we would be put on the United States census as black, where we would lose our oral history and our identity as American Indians along with our land. I would be raised as a little black girl in North Omaha until I was able to discover my own history through legal research and writing. And in discovering my own reclassification, I realized that it was impossible that my family was the only family this happened to. And then over time, I realized that because of the baby follows the belly this is not just my story, but the reclassification of American Indians into Black subjects to the United States Census is the story of all of us. After 1865 and 1868, with the 13th and 14th Amendment, the United States would use the 14th Amendment to solidify their subjection with the loophole of the 13th Amendment. And we spoke about the 13th Amendment earlier, which said that slavery nor involuntary servitude should be allowed in the United States except as punishment for crime. It is important to understand that this law is a law that overturned the baby follows the belly law. It is important to understand that this law is the law that solidifies and makes the foundation for mass incarceration and over-policing to this day of the very same people affected by the baby follows the belly law of 1662 and 1682, which makes us history's longest survivors of genocide. It is important that when interpreting the 14th Amendment in the American Indian homeschool, it's important that you all understand that we started at the beginning. When the United States interprets the 14th Amendment, they started the Dred Scott decision. That in itself is a tool of erasure. Our history does not begin in 1865. Our history doesn't even begin with the baby follows the belly law, but it does begin in America before the United States was ever formed. And their own wrongful deed of enslaving indigenous children is the very proof that solidifies our identity as the original people of America, the original American Indian. It is important to understand that after the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court took it upon itself to use racist cases like the slaughterhouse cases and Plessy v. Ferguson to give power right back to the states to discriminate and segregate the very people they just claimed to free. It's important to understand that the 14th Amendment was not just to overturn the Dred Scott decision. It actually wasn't important to overturn the Dred Scott decision at all. Why it was important was so that they could use our bodies for political power and count us as whole in the Union North so that they could have greater political power, but they would use these racist laws like black codes and vagrancy laws to over-police us so that we had no right to vote. So they would use our bodies for voting power, but ensure that we had no right to vote. So when we realize that we are one of the only countries historically ran by immigrants, it becomes clear that with the reclassification of the United States, that their original intention of suppressing our political power still stands till this day. It shows you how powerful their tools of oppression actually are, that we do not have the confidence to run our own country, and that was done systematically and on purpose. And that the only way for them to stay in power is if we believe that they have the power, and if we do not know that this is our country to take responsibility for. It is my belief that once we know that this is ours to take responsibility for, as we have always done, we will do our due diligence to make sure that we take great care of America as our own, not as the people who have been stolen, who are not from here, and who are countryless, but the people who are responsible to uphold her truth, integrity, and honesty. It is important that we look at the legal definitions of race one more time on the United States Census. Black is defined as a person having origins in the racial groups of Africa, whose mother or ancestors has a tribe that they can point to that they are from. We know that lawfully we do not fit into that determination. As we are the descendants of Africans, we are not Africans, therefore we do not have a tribe that we can point to. When we look at the definition of American Indian, it says American Indian is a person having origins in any of the original peoples of America. The baby follows the belly law proves that we are the original people of America 125 years before the United States was ever formed. White on the United States Census is defined as the original people of North Africa. And we know from doing our own research and writing that the 1740 Negro law defined the term Negro as the original people of North Africa. So why is that on the United States Census now as white? And the reason why that has to be done is so that the United States can seamlessly act like they are upholding the Treaty of Peace and Friendship with Morocco when really they aren't. So they're showing you that they will not put North Africans into a category of Black because they're showing you that that is what they are calling their slave race. They signed a treaty that said, we will not enslave you. That is why North Africans are not considered the racial groups of Africa, even though it's Africa. So when we look at this critically, And simply, it becomes very clear who we are and how we have been reclassified over time. It becomes very clear that the main culprit is the public school, and that indoctrinating children from the age of 4 to 18 and telling them that they came from nowhere, that they have nothing, and that they will never be anything is a form of genocide that leads to self-destruction, where you no longer need a colonizer. You don't believe that you have any worth. We can replace that inferiority with pride in who we really are as the original people of America. So when we look at the definition of American Indian on the United States Census, it is a person having origins in any of the original people of America. And we know that the baby follows the belly law proves that we are the original people of America, because it places all of our mothers in America when we were enslaved and born into slavery. The United States, however, adds a clause that says, and who maintains tribal affiliation or community attachment. Because they know that we are the slave Indians, enslaved through the baby follows the belly law, and not the tribal Indians, Indians in enmity with the government, this eliminates us from being able to identify as American Indian on the census. So we, the baby belly birthright community, do not fit into the legal status defined as Black on the United States Census, because it directly contradicts the 14th Amendment that acknowledges we were born in America. And if we cannot identify with our just to soil American citizenship by marking American Indian on the United States Census, because our colonization means we cannot provide a tribal number, and if we cannot identify on the United States Census as ancient Berber people of North Africa, because that is now considered white, then what does that make us? Extinct. And that is how you commit a paper genocide.